Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. So I'm Catherine Johnston. I'm the Chief Exec of Royal Voluntary Service, and welcome to Reimagining Social Care, the Role of Active Citizenship. This is the fourth report that we've written under what we call Kickstarting a Volunteer Revolution banner. It's a report that we wrote pre-pandemic, which was upholding the belief that Royal Voluntary Service has dear to its heart and its core, is that volunteering is good for you, it's good for all, it's good for prosperity, it's good for your communities, and it keeps you healthy and fit if you have a great volunteering opportunity. So I am absolutely delighted to be chairing this today, particularly as I worked out rather worryingly that 44 years ago, almost to the day, I myself started my volunteering in a care home called Spackman House in Essex. So that tells you I was an Essex girl. And for those who can't do the maths, I was 14. But I actually volunteered between 1978 and 1982, almost consistently. And it is what made me decide to become a nurse. So actually, even all of that time ago, volunteering was happening. And I think having just lived through the pandemic and seen the value that volunteers have brought to the NHS, particularly with the very practical tasks that can be done that help support the health and care professionals, it feels to me a bit like social care has been the poor relation through no fault of its own, and it's a fantastic profession, particularly in and around the care homes. And that's why we wanted to write this and partner with Anchor, and I've got Sarah Jones, the Chief Exec of Anchor, with us today. With the University of Kent, I have Julie McInnes, who's with us today, and you're going to hear from both of them, and our very own Dr. Alison Smith, who is the Head of Research at Royal Voluntary Service, and they've got some exciting evidence and stats and findings from the work that we've been doing over the last 6 months. I don't want to really speak very much more other than to say that this is really important, that actually, it's a win-win if we get it right. There is definitely an appetite for more people to step forward in health and social care, and that is without a shadow of a doubt. But it's about creating the environment, the critical success factors that actually allow people to do that and be received and welcomed into those environments in the right way. That means they want to stay and flourish and improve their own health and well-being and their own self-worth and confidence levels, whilst contributing significantly to the care of others, not least of all the workforce within social care. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm, to start with, going to hand over to Sarah, who's just going to say a few words about Anchor and about her role as Chief Exec, what she thinks about the work that we've been doing together. So Sarah, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And yes, I'm a fellow Essex girl, so it's good to hear. I've got a compatriot on the panel. Anchor is delighted to be supporting the launch of this report into volunteering and social care, because we see every day that volunteers in our care homes working alongside colleagues play a hugely important role in helping people live more fulfilling lives, and our volunteers can bring such enrichment to the daily life of the people that they spend time with. They are supporting day trips and holidays and sing-alongs and quizzes and choirs. Anyone who goes to visit a care home will, you can feel the joy when you walk into one of those activities that's being supported by a volunteer. It's a wonderful enriching experience, and many of our volunteers have very enduring connections with homes over many years. Indeed, some volunteers have also gone on to have and build really successful careers with us in the caring field, well-being, supporting people, which again is a hugely beneficial outcome. We also benefit from groups of volunteers from supportive companies, organisations such as the National Citizenship Scheme. They help us revamp gardens to repurpose communal space. The list goes on, and perhaps if we have some time at the end, I'll go through some more specifics and share them with you. But I know that colleagues will be keen to share more of the detail with the report with you. So not to steal their thunder, but one thing that really jumped out at me was the statistic that 98% of our colleagues enjoy working with the volunteers. And so we're absolutely delighted to support this report, which will increase awareness amongst people who might be inclined to volunteer with us, to help people understand the opportunities that exist, the opportunities to get involved, and of course, as Catherine said, to that lovely circular purpose of improving the profile of the whole sector as well, and the esteem in which all of our colleagues and volunteers are held. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hand over to Julie.
Thank you, Sarah. I should have some slides, I think. Oh, perfect. Lovely. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Julie McInnes, and I'm really pleased to be invited to this webinar to talk about the evidence for volunteering in social care. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a researcher in integrated health and social care at the Centre for Health Services Studies at the University of Kent. I'm also a nurse by background, and I trained in Essex, so there's definitely a theme developing here, isn't there? Something about Essex, clearly. And I'm also actually a current volunteer. So the Royal Voluntary Service asked me to carry out an independent evidence review of the current state of volunteering in social care, and that's both in a care home or care home setting, but also in a home care or domiciliary setting as well. So the review focused on the roles and activities carried out by volunteers, the outcomes for older people, staff, organisations, and the wider health and social care system. Also looked at the challenges or barriers to volunteering, and so now I'll go on to present a summary or a snapshot of some of the findings from that review. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. Hope everyone can see that okay. So the activities carried out by volunteers in social care settings are numerous and varied, and Sarah's obviously just sort of mentioned some of those. But in home or domiciliary care, this includes visiting and befriending, escorts to hospital appointments, for example, and also family carer support. In care homes, from the literature, there are over 40 identified roles for volunteers. And again, Sarah's mentioned some of these. So things like running classes in groups, so exercise classes, dance classes, and one-to-one activities such as helping people write letters or correspondence, taking walks, or importantly, providing companionship. And other activities such as supporting people to eat at meal times or running drinks trolleys, for example. So there's lots of evidence in the literature of the wide variety of roles that volunteers can take on, particularly in the care home setting. So activities can therefore be summarised as both relational, so that companionship, but also task orientated, so sort of meal times work. So there's a huge variety of tasks and opportunities, I guess. So there are numerous benefits for volunteers in social care which are cited in the literature, and these can be themed as benefits for older people and their families, benefits for volunteers themselves, and benefits for social care staff, providers, organisations, and at a wider health and social care system level. So in terms of older people, volunteers have a positive impact on social, physical, and emotional well-being. Older people are more engaged with other people and their surroundings with the presence of volunteers. Mostly the impact is seen at the time of engaging with activities. So sort of so-called in the moment benefits. So whilst volunteers are running classes or talking to residents, there is not much evidence, it has to be said, about any long-term impacts such as reducing cognitive decline, for example, or improving memory in the longer term. So, but this in the moment benefit seems to be, kind of huge, really. The presence of volunteers is also associated with increased satisfaction in care of family members, both in home care and care home settings. For volunteers, again, the benefits are numerous and include altruistic and social benefits. And again, I think as we've mentioned already today, enhanced employability is also cited as well as educational advancement. And interestingly, care home settings may appeal to younger people as an opportunity to gain experience of care prior to entering health and care professions, such as nurses, therapists or social workers, for example. So we see there's quite a few examples of that in the literature. Staff working in care homes particularly report greater job satisfaction and may report incidents of reduced stress, really partly related to workload, but not exclusively. But there's quite conflicting evidence around staff workload, both in domiciliary care and care homes. On the one hand, staff value the contribution of volunteers in providing care, but there are also concerns about the time needed to recruit, manage and support volunteers, so it's a kind of double-edged sword in a way. At a health and social care system level, the value of volunteering includes strengthening the relationship between services and communities, and in home or domiciliary care, supporting the integration of services, such as bringing services delivered by different providers together, coordinating activities around the older person, and supporting continuity of care. Most of this, it has to be said, are kind of claims, and there's actually very little robust evidence to support those claims, but there's lots of sort of anecdotal case study type evidence around those wider system levels. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of barriers or challenges of volunteering in social care, the process of recruiting volunteers, such as the need for DBS checks and other processes such as the CQC fit and proper person checks, for example, can be lengthy and often disproportionate for the activities that the volunteers will be carrying out. And that puts both sort of care homes and local authorities off, but it also, to some extent, puts volunteers off. They don't want to undergo very lengthy processes to do sort of a small amount of volunteering. Also, in terms of risk, social care staff in particular had some concerns around the need for volunteers to uphold professional codes of conduct. So obviously they've gone through a lot of training to maintain those professional codes of conduct, and things like establishing boundaries and barriers between sort of residents and volunteers was a theme that came up quite a lot. Around the need for volunteers to understand those professional kind of barriers. So there are things to address. The ability to recruit volunteers varied widely, with recruitment frequently described as ad hoc. Care homes described literally people just knocking on their door, for example. There was also geographical variation in volunteer supply and demand. And there are examples in the literature of voluntary organisations taking responsibility for volunteer recruitment, training and support in care homes, which did reduce the burden of staff. But this need for volunteers to be properly inducted and ongoing training, particularly around dementia care and bereavement, they are the two examples that are cited quite a lot in terms of where volunteers feel they need more training or more support, and that's widely cited in the literature. So in terms of management and coordination, the need for a specific member of staff to manage and coordinate volunteer activities was seen as important. And again, there are examples in the literature where this role is outsourced, as it were, to voluntary organisations who can fulfil that role and support organisations who are using volunteers. So that's the kind of headlines. I hope that's been useful. So thank you for listening. And I'll now hand over to Alison.
Thank you, Julie. Great. So what I'm going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes on is two pieces of survey research that we did. One on public attitudes to volunteering in care, and then also workforce attitudes. And then I'll move on to some recommendations before we then open up to questions. So if Helen, could I ask you for the next slide? Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, we did two pieces of research. The first one was done in July, and this was a sample of the general public. about 2,000, and it was a representative sample of those that are 18 and over. And the aim of that study was to really understand sort of public attitudes to volunteering in care, and then what might be sort of, you know, the supply side of things in terms of volunteering in this sector. Then we wanted to really understand workforce attitudes to volunteering, primarily in care homes. So in partnership with Anchor, we were able to survey 100 members of their staff. And this was to really kind of understand workforce attitudes to working with volunteers. So I'll go over each of those surveys in detail. Next slide, please. So the first I'm going to focus on is the public attitudes. And just to say, both pieces of data are incredibly delightful research. Oftentimes at the moment, research, whether it's NHS data or ONS data, seems to be a bit sort of doom and gloom, but this is just delightful research that I'm going to present with sort of a core solution. So if I could get you to move to the next slide, Helen, that would be brilliant. So we wanted to sort of understand what was currently going on in the market. So the question we asked this representative sample was, do you currently or would you consider volunteering to support social care? And 6% said that they were already volunteering in a care home. 5% stated that they were planning to, and actually 38% said they would consider volunteering in a care home. We then asked the sample of those responding, 38%, were they aware of volunteering in care homes locally? And of those that said that they would consider volunteering, 21% were aware of local opportunities, but actually 79 were unaware of opportunities, which means, which suggests that there's certainly some work for us to do in this area if we have this extensive cohort of individuals that are really interested and we're really not sort of capitalizing on that at all. Next slide, Helen. Thank you. What was also really interesting was the age differences. And there was a linear relationship in terms of differences through the life course. So far more younger people were interested and currently volunteering or planning to or would consider than older cohorts. So I think when we look at recruitment in this area, we need to be kind of mindful of this, both to capitalize on that interest in younger people, but obviously maybe there's different recruitment methods that we need to make it more appealing to those later on in the life course. Next slide, please, Helen. The research also highlighted that 51% would not actually consider, so the majority would actually not consider volunteering in a care home. And so within the survey, we then also asked, well, what are the reasons for that? Because if we understand the reasons, maybe we can sort of mitigate or do something differently to sort of change those perceptions. So interestingly, almost 1 in 4 said that they would find it too challenging to work with people that are too frail or have dementia. 1 in 4 also said that it wasn't appealing volunteer role. And then almost 1 in 5, or just over 1 in 5, said they would be too scared to make a mistake and cause harm. And these are all things that probably how we design the role profiles, how we go out for recruitment are all something we probably need to consider if we want to grow the market of volunteering in this space. Next slide. We also asked about sort of motivations. So what would, which of the following around a series of statements would describe your motivation for considering volunteering in a care home? Really interesting, actually, career, and considering a career in care came out sort of fairly high compared to other services, surveys in this area. And again, younger people were far more interested in volunteering as a route to care than latter cohorts across the life course. And this suggests that volunteering could be a great pathway into care, and we're probably not doing enough in this area to really nurture that. Also, people stated they had quite a clear purpose for wanting to volunteer in a care home. So 1 in 4 were motivated because they had a loved one in a care home. Interestingly, almost 40% stated that they wanted, they really understood the pressure that care home staff were under and really wanted to sort of support and help them. And then they felt that they could really sort of make a difference to add or improve the quality of care that was provided. Interestingly, 1 in 3 said that they were motivated because they had the skills and talents that they could use. And this is perhaps something we haven't sort of thought about in the past. And this, this potentially is something hugely impactful for sort of care homes, that people have these talents that they want to use to make life better for staff and residents. So I think a really important finding. And then if I could, Helen, if you could move on to the next, thank you. Those volunteering or wishing to volunteer are most interested in really those resident-facing roles. So those roles that enable people, that are really kind of relational, enable people to connect. So almost 60% were really interested in providing that one-to-one support and providing that companionship, that cognitive stimulation. And then 47% were happy to help out at meal times. And then 42% were really interested in more sort of group activities. So whether it was running exercise class or music groups or film groups. And then lesser, but still quite significant, there was also a group that were happy to help out if it was helpful in more back office functions such as admin, clerical work, or helping to improve sort of the wider physical environment of the care home through, say, green spaces and gardens. Interestingly, there were some gender splits here. So females were by far more interested in one-to-one relationships and mealtime support, and younger people were much more interested in sort of group-based activities than one-to-one. But maybe that has to do around sort of skill and confidence building that we might need to consider. Next slide. The next few slides are presenting the data around workforce, and again, this is like hugely positive and delightful research, and very thankful to Anchor for supporting this piece of research. So we interviewed 100 of Anchor staff, and actually what was nice is they broadly, a third fell into particular groups. So 32% were managers, 32% were actually frontline clinical staff, and then about 35 were other sort of support staff. And we aim to interview both those staff that were currently working with volunteers, which were 67%, and then about 33 that were not working with volunteers. And I'll quickly present the data on both of those. So 98 stated that they really enjoyed working with volunteers. And we asked staff, well, what type of sort of activities do staff predominantly provide? And it was around sort of those resident-facing roles, such as companionship, social activities, some mealtime support, and then there was some help around sort of mobilising and getting residents dressed. Overwhelmingly, care home staff felt that volunteers added a lot of value for residents and also staff as well. And actually, this was much higher than a similar survey that we did in the NHS with the King's Fund in 2018. Next slide, please. As I said, we also interviewed a sample that were currently not working with volunteers, just to understand their wish or desire to work with volunteers, and 90% stated that they would like to see more volunteers. And then we asked about, well, what are those roles you would like to see? And what was really interesting is from this versus the previous slide is actually more staff feel that they'd like support at mealtime. So encouraging residents to eat and drink. And we know dehydration and malnutrition is an issue in care home. And this seems like, you know, a practical thing volunteers can help out with. Next slide, please, Helen. We also asked in this survey what staff thought was the ultimate contribution of volunteers, and 67 said that providing essential reassurance and company to residents was really important. But actually, they also recognised those huge benefits for staff as well, in terms of reducing pressure, but also freeing up colleagues' time to really focus more on those sort of clinical care tasks that are really important. So I think it's interesting that they recognise not only the benefits for those residents, of which there's enormous, but also the ability for them to do their job better. In the interest of time, I'll if you can go on to the next slide, Helen. Thank you. We also, because we wanted some insight around, you know, what more we can do, how can we strengthen the impact of volunteering in care homes, we asked staff what would make things better. And 82% said better knowledge amongst colleagues about the role of volunteers and what they can do. But also they mentioned greater awareness amongst the public on volunteering opportunities in care homes. So they recognise that as well. And then more or better training for volunteers as well. Next slide, please. Before we move on to the recommendations, I thought it was actually just really important to kind of reflect on the vision for social care. So ultimately, where do we want to go in terms of social care? Next slide, please. We don't necessarily give care the consideration it needs, yet actually care is fundamental to our well-being. It's an activity that we both give and receive through the life course, and without it, really, we would cease to thrive and prosper. And both Julie and I were really kind of struck by some of the thoughts that Anna Dixon and Hilary Cotton were talking about in terms of developing a more enriching model of care, one that looks at how we build more sort of relational care rather than transactional care, and how we enable people to flourish through the care we provide, rather than really focus on people's basic needs, such as, you know, essentially food, clothing, and shelter. How do we get to sort of that sort of higher level of care that really enriches people's lives and enables people to thrive? And I think, you know, post-pandemic, if we can call it post-pandemic, you know, is a huge sort of reset moment. We can see from the data public interest in this area, an emerging appetite to do much more in this space. And I think part of the solution is around sort of active citizenship, and really through that enriching care for those that both live in care homes but also work in care homes. And now I will quickly move on to some of the solutions or recommendations. So we can see from the research that there is a public appetite. We really don't do enough to grow this public interest or reduce the barriers in this sector. I think we can offer way more diverse and flexible opportunities for the public, ones from micro-volunteering to that much more sort of formal traditional volunteering. I think a focus maybe on better training and volunteer support could really grow and be a step change in voluntary action in this sector. Also building the band, so we know that, and it's clear from this research that care home staff actually want more volunteers, but it also seems that there is some room for development. So staff seem to want more understanding and knowledge about the role of volunteers. They want to be involved in shaping those volunteer roles and input into training as well. So I think this is all really helpful insight as we look to sort of grow voluntary action in this sector. Next slide, please, Helen. Then I think well-designed, and this certainly comes out in Julie's literature review, well-designed volunteer roles and activities are essential, and the benefits gained might differ by volunteer role. Unsurprisingly, more relational volunteer roles, such as those one-to-one, structured, consistent roles, appear to be critical for maximizing resident outcomes, but for staff, they might want sort of more transactional roles, such as support at mealtime and supporting residents to get dressed, which might lead to a reduction in work stress and pressure. And I think also some of these roles, if we have a much more structured, consistent and supportive volunteer program, it might change some of those in the moment benefits to something that is more enduring. So we know through work we've done on cognitive stimulation therapy within sort of our community program, that consistent CST actually does have quite a significant impact on cognition. And I wonder if we take some of those sort of community benefits and build something that has sort of a higher dose and is more consistent in nursing residential home cares, that really lead to not only just the moment gains, but more consistent sort of better sort of functionality for residents. And then finally, it's such a missed opportunity that we don't look at volunteering as essentially a gateway into career and job. It's a wasted opportunity, particularly in this sector. We know that younger people are really interested in volunteering. Why are we not doing more to nurture this group? It seems, you know, it seems like such a missed opportunity and a no-brainer that we really need to do more in this area, knowing some of the workforce challenges. I will stop there. I think that is the last slide, because I'm quite sort of conscious that people might want to ask questions. So thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Alison. And again, really great presentations from everybody, great insight. And as Alison said, you know, often at the moment, research and insight is pretty doom and gloom. And actually, the findings in this work have been really uplifting and show lots of opportunities to correlate around this. So we're going to hand over to you now. So we're very fortunate at Royal Voluntary Service to have Fiona Longhurst, who has had this hidden talent that we discovered when we were all in lockdown, that she's actually a brilliant MC. She's actually quite funny as well. So she sort of, I'm really setting her up here. So Fiona is going to sort of bring all of the questions together and ask them of the panelists. And we're going to try and get through as many as we can in the time that we've got left, which is just over 20 minutes. So we've done quite well. So over to Fiona.
Thank you, and thank you, panel. A fantastic piece of research, really lovely addition to the Kickstart series. We have got a number of questions already in the chat box, so please do keep adding them. We'll get through as many as we can. There's a couple of areas of sort of that I can see clustering together, so I'll start with those. So there's a focus on the issue around resources in care homes, and whether there's any concern that volunteers will be potentially misused or used to replace caring jobs, and what can we do to ensure this doesn't happen. That was from Justin Davis Smith, and on the same sort of track, slightly different, from Sarah Lotto, asking about asking Julie specifically if the issue around professional boundaries is an actual challenge. Is that a challenge or just a perceived challenge that's preventing the engagement of volunteers? So I'm going to come first, I think, to Sarah, if that's okay, around Justin's point around the pressure in care homes and caring jobs, and how volunteers can play into that and whether there are any risks. Sarah.
Thank you. And it's a really important point, isn't it? I mean, we know that in the sector, we're up to around 165,000 vacancies in the sector overall. And it's a real challenge for all organisations in the sector to recruit sort of safely and appropriately. From an anchor perspective, we've made it a sort of a central tenet of how we run the organisation. So we're a living wage foundation employer, and we've got a full accreditation for that. And we support our colleagues in care and indeed across housing as well in many different ways to in order to be able to recruit and retain appropriate levels of staff. It does come back to, again, that fear that I think it actually came up as a quote, that volunteers can be scared of getting involved, and I can absolutely understand that about their perception either of what the role they'll be undertaking, or that they'll suddenly be placed with a responsibility to do one of those task-oriented roles rather than a relationship-oriented role. So I think it absolutely comes down to ensuring that we match a volunteer with the right opportunity, because many opportunities exist across many different types of services and in many different ways. And so that we build that awareness of those different opportunities, that people don't feel that by taking one step, they're going to be inexorably drawn into something that they're going to feel very uncomfortable with. And of course, on the other side, ensuring that our colleagues are very clear about how they can support and the interaction of their role on the in a care home setting. But certainly, you know, we're very, we're very clear that encouraging volunteers is not a way to prop up a sector. This is absolutely part of complementing and enriching a sector and the service that people are receiving.
Thank you, Sarah. And Julie, did you have any thoughts on the professional boundaries issue and whether it's an actual challenge or a perceived one?
It's very interesting, and it's a really good question. I think it is more than a perceived one, because there are examples in the literature of where it's gone wrong, essentially. However, what we don't know is how prevalent that is, if you know what I mean. So it's not about how common this is, but the fact that it is an actual can be an actual concern. I mean, a couple of examples on the literature of where volunteers swapped telephone numbers, personal telephone numbers, for example, and also where volunteers invited members of their family in to meet their friend, the resident. So there were and there were conversations needing to be had. However, so I guess it's more than perceived. We don't know how prevalent this is, and where it's worked well is, and it comes back to the point I made about, really important how induction is and ongoing support and training. So this is wholly preventable in my view, but it is something that needs to be addressed, I think, at that sort of induction and ongoing training to sort of instill some of those professional values in volunteers. So it's in no way insurmountable, but I think it is something that organisations using volunteers do need to take on board.
Brilliant, thanks Julie. There's a couple of questions, Alison, on the research methodology. I think some surprise at the volume of people that have responded saying that they already volunteer in care at 6%. Do you think there's, how are people who've responded to the survey, how are they defining that involvement in care? Was it specifically care homes or was it in care more generally? And could that be perhaps why it's such a large group is saying that they're already involved? There's also a question about how the sample was collected. I think it was a nationally representative sample for the volunteer research, wasn't it, Alison?
Yes. Yeah, so it was a nationally representative sample of 18 or over, and the specific question was actually around care homes, and it did define some of the activities such as befriending and mealtime support, and the actual number is 5.6%, rounded up to 6, which is actually higher than some of the previous data, which I think sort of had it around sort of 1%, but I think that's 10 or 11 years out of date, that research, and there was particular sort of methodological issues with that. So it was actually specifically asking about volunteering in care homes.
Thanks, Alison. We've got a question here around who does the volunteering and who might be invited to do it, who could participate in it. Jeremy Hughes is asking, is there evidence of the value of volunteering as an activity undertaken by care home residents themselves or users of the community services? Which is, I guess, about that inclusion point, like, how broad an opportunity is this and which parts of society are invited to participate? Catherine, I'm going to take this question to you because I know you'll have some thoughts on this one.
Okay, so not specifically in a care home setting because I don't know the answer to that, but in a NHS setting, we were very, very surprised, happily so, particularly in the NHS Volunteer Responder Scheme, when people being referred into the scheme to receive support were also offered, quite a significant cohort were offered the opportunity to volunteer themselves on the check-in and chat role. So these are people who were extremely clinically vulnerable, who needed to shield in the main part of the pandemic, so therefore were seen to be at a significant disadvantage. And what we did was said, would you like actually as part of your social prescription to volunteer? And many did, and we tracked them on the ONS data. We tracked them both against their peer group, but also against normal general population. And they fared better than people in the normal population. It was extraordinary how they were able to overcome their own exceptional clinical vulnerabilities in lockdown, and by volunteering transact themselves into a better score on the ONS health and wellbeing scores as a result, which was against all of the odds. And this comes back to the fundamentals around volunteering of purpose, connectedness, value, being able to work alongside others and understand, what challenges other people have and how they overcome them. You know, so I mean, I could go on forever. So I think there should be great opportunities for people who choose or sometimes choose or don't choose to live within a residential care home setting to continue to volunteer. In some of the supported living, there's many more examples. So where you go to sort of extra care, where you have the different stages of residency depending upon the state of your health and well-being. You know, in the early parts of those residencies, you often have people running coffee mornings, craft classes, you know, in the shared spaces within those environments. So I think there's plenty to draw on, but much more thinking needs to go on. I don't know what Sarah thinks, because I don't know how much of that goes on, particularly in Anchor.
Yeah, it's such a good point to raise, actually, because you're absolutely right. Whenever you visit a housing scheme or extra care or a care home, there is always someone who's the locus of that activity. There is always someone who's creating, as a resident, a really positive environment. And I think you're right, certainly in housing and extra care settings. I think probably those people would be indistinguishable from a volunteer that might come from a setting outside. Absolutely that, whether it's organising a craft activity or a trip externally. But also in a residential care setting, absolutely, there is always someone who will start the sing-along, or who will be doing the dancing, or just creating that joyful environment. It's a really excellent point, actually, that turning the residents as kind of volunteers point. Excellent.
Can I jump in as well, Fiona, if that's
Absolutely.
okay? Just to say, the full literature review, I think that's going to go on the website at a later date. But there's one example there when we looked at the literature, which was the Abbeyfield Society with the NCVO, and they did a project which was called Residents as Volunteers. So it's a particular pilot about training residents to take on volunteer roles without care homes. And again, that example is in the literature review if you want to find out a bit more about that.
It's really, because something that we always think is of being as so important is recognising that when someone comes to live with us in one of our services, they are a person with a history and a hinterland and a life of experience, and that again is something that can be really brought out in that setting in a really positive way.
Thanks, Sarah. Great contributions there. Fascinating part of the story, isn't it? We have a question in the chat, actually, Sarah, which I'll stay with you for, because it's asking about the sort of the more practical side, I suppose, of how you manage volunteers in a care home setting. You know, who takes responsibility for things like the expenses management, insurance, essential training? And Anchor, did you manage that internally? Did you work with outside organisations to support you to do that? How did you get that arranged in your particular settings?
I think it'll vary. As I say, we encourage people to volunteer from all different backgrounds and in all different settings. I think certainly in a care home, we were saying that's one of the challenges to overcome, isn't it? The fact that we have to have training, we have to have the checks. And I can imagine that they do feel disproportionate, but it's something that has to be in place. And particularly at the moment, we're finding not only with volunteers but also with our colleagues that those things are taking longer, and that is a real problem. I think it varies though, so I think the majority of cases it would be, certainly in a residential care home setting, it would be the management of that care home with the support of our central function that would manage that for them. And obviously when we work with larger companies, then we can work in alliance with companies. Say we've worked with Aviva, Lloyds, Yorkshire Bank. That would be a much more collaborative effort between us to try and remove some of those barriers.
Absolutely. I was interested to hear about the role for corporates actually in employee volunteering, if we're looking to expand volunteering in care homes. Yeah, do you see that as a sort of a potential avenue for growth, Sarah?
Definitely. I mean, particularly when you've got a really big project, like a DIY SOS type scenario, you know. And so when we wanted to transform a garden setting, and obviously we all became aware of the importance of outside space, particularly over the last couple of years, but how enriching the outside space is for people. And so converting outside space, building pergolas, we've had all sorts of things like that going on. And I think the volunteers have found it hugely rewarding as well. So yeah, getting big blocks of people to undertake big tasks, that's been great.
Excellent. And perhaps related to that, there's a question around, you know, how to expand and, you know, how quickly can we expand this involvement of people and volunteers? And is there a role for perhaps the more flexible micro volunteering type approaches? Catherine, do you have a thought on that?
I think it'd be quite pompous of me to say yes, because I don't know that the case is proven yet. By micro volunteering, we're talking about a more digital approach, utilising an app. People choose when they want to volunteer, and dip in and dip out. And often at the moment, micro volunteering is transactional rather than relationship building. So we've been really fortunate that we've going to continue to work with the NHS on NHS volunteer responders, and that is going to have an element of social care contained within it. And we're going to think about, what does that look like in a micro volunteering and social care environment, because we need to be really, really careful that we don't just make sweeping assumptions about, because this worked transactionally in the NHS, it will work in a social care or a care home setting. We do need to do the work and really, really challenge ourselves to think about, what is the experience like for a resident, for a member of the professional services within social care, and the volunteer themselves, and make sure that all three come together in the joyful way that we see, that actually gives everybody the satisfaction and the impact that they want. So I think potentially, yes. The reason why I think it's worth us looking at micro volunteering in social care and in care home setting is because it does seem to be a great entry level opportunity for people who perhaps haven't seen themselves stepping forward in their communities before. We've seen in the last sort of cohort of people that we recruited for the vaccination programme as stewards, more than 20% of those volunteers were coming from backgrounds that you wouldn't traditionally have seen stepping forward in the more hard to reach. I hate that term, but that's sort of the language and terminology that would have been used pre-pandemic. So if you think, and forgive the pun, Sarah, but care homes are anchor institutions in their own right. There are care homes in virtually every community, and in some communities they are treated with the utmost suspicion, and in others they are sort of the heartbeat of that community. And we saw that play out really, really viscerally during the pandemic. And I've been to lots of care awards since the pandemic, where care home staff and their volunteers and everything all been getting awards for how they all came together in the community. So if we're going to treat care homes as anchor institutions, then what is the micro volunteering opportunity that helps to bust some of the myths, help people get an entry level, help people come and try and see if it's an area of interest for them, whilst also helping with the lighter touch induction, the lighter touch entry levels, the more transactional volunteering to start with. So for instance, how many of the people who came to build the DIY SOS Pergola and Garden actually have been encouraged since they built it to come back for some taster sessions for hydration and nutrition, or for activity? How many of those people have musical talent, are governors of the local schools, and could do the connectivity? So I think there is something we've got to look at, but I think we need to take a little bit of time and we need to think it through really carefully, because what we don't want to do is sink care homes with this sudden influx of lots of excited people who you think micro volunteering, a bit like a steward volunteer in the NHS, is something that they can do for high days and holidays. We just need to think about how it would work in that setting. Sorry, that's a long answer, but I think it's quite complex and we really do need to think about it.
Yeah, another area of complexity perhaps is around the way that the different types of care home providers there are out there. Obviously, there are some for-profit care homes, and a couple of comments in the chat are focusing on that, and whether there is there might be some reticence from volunteers to volunteer for effectively for a business, and whether there's any evidence. I don't know, Julie, if there's anything in the research literature that you looked at that touched on that topic at all.
again, a really good question, and the short answer is no. There's very little about the different kinds of provision and how volunteering differs across those different settings. We just don't have enough evidence, so that's the short answer. Really,
it's an unknown at the moment, and
I think so. Yeah,
we need to see how things unfold. But staying with the desire to sort of push forward we have this incredible research which is demonstrating how excited people are about the prospect, or how keen they are to support care homes, and the young people in particular, came through loud and clear that they would be interested. I wanted to ask you, Alison, about them. Is that a real opportunity to not just bring young people into volunteering, hopefully creating a volunteering habit, but also potentially pathways into employment? Should we be looking at building links with colleges and universities, for example?
I think the answer is yes and all of that. I think it's an amazing finding from the research that young people are really interested in this sector, both in terms of support and capacity for those currently living and working in care homes, but also as a future workforce. And as Catherine sort of mentioned, I'd sort of a fairly similar sort of career journey. So as a teenager, I started volunteering in a care home, which got me interested in gerontology and aging, which ultimately, has sort of carved my my career path. So I think those early influences and getting people interested in this sector can only be great for the social care sector. I think we just haven't capitalized on that enough and supported sort of that willingness, and we really need to do more, both as a charity, but other providers in this sector as well, to really nurture that.
Alison, and what more can we do to sort of nudge things along? Catherine, who else is a stakeholder in this who could support? I'm thinking about perhaps local authorities. Do they have a part to play? Who are the stakeholders that can really assist? Because it feels like there is a will that we've spotted here, and obviously huge appreciation from the staff in our survey. There's a question actually about who we polled from a staff perspective, and it was among anchor care homes specifically, wasn't it, Alison?
Yes.
Yeah, it was. So it was an anchor care home study among staff. But yes, so Catherine, who would be the extra players in this who could really support to push this along?
So there's obviously a policy part to this, isn't there, about the willingness to create the welcoming environment and the acceptance that volunteers could be an integral part of the way in which we deliver our care home products. And I think there's people working in care homes, such as Sarah in Anchor, who are leading the way in showing how it can work really effectively and be an enriching part of a enriched care model. So I think we need to take the people that are already doing it and doing it well and help them to amplify and share their stories and how they've done it. So I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, we need to be kind. And this is something that I've learned during the pandemic, is everybody's heads on most days want to explode at the moment because there is so much going on. We've all somebody described it as us all living through sort of a war over the last 2 to 3 years. And we've all got a degree of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is not abating because of the ongoing, crises in varying different sectors. So I think we need to be kind. And rather than saying this would be revolutionary for your care home or for your care home group or whatever, we actually need to go and work alongside people and say, we spot an opportunity here for you to enrich the way in which your staff are working, the way in which your residents are living. So again, not blaming people for why this hasn't happened, or you know, holding up the fact that the NHS have done it in bucket loads over the pandemic, and, you know, clever them, whereas social care has been a poor relation. It wasn't designed to be like that, and it was because people had very different settings and very different opportunities, and therefore, you know, we can see the potential, but we need to work together to maximise that. And then lastly, commissioners and, you know, local authorities, etc. Again, we need to recognise there is much less funding. I mean, I feel like I'm in a movie that's gone back to the 1980s. I'm sad to say I'm old enough to remember the 1980s in quite some detail, but this, you know, cost of living, no money, having to close services, all of that is affecting everybody. And therefore going in as a, you know, me particularly as a, like, an enthusiastic volunteering, you know, is good for everything, it's the solution to everything, is really not going to help, because actually it's got to be nestled with commissioners and people who've got funds in a way that actually demonstrates the enormous value that it brings, that, you know, this kind of win-win scenario, and not as a solution to workforce issues. And that's absolutely critical. And that was the one thing that saw the pivot in the NHS. Once everybody became comfortable that this wasn't about plugging workforce gaps, actually we opened up this sort of new world that actually is continuing to evolve. And I think we've got all the potential to be able to do that in the care home setting with great people like Anka and Sarah, and lots of research and evidence points, helpfully, you know, today shared with Alison and Julie.
What a great point to end on, Catherine. We're out of time. Over to you, Catherine, just to close.
Okay, well, just thank you so much to Anka particularly for, you know, making their organisation available to us, you know, at a really, really busy time, as I've already said, and to the University of Kent and Julie and Alison for doing some great, very optimistic, but sort of life sort of enriching findings that actually say, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. And actually, there are really practical things that we can do to connect our citizens who want to be active to anchor institutions such as care homes in a really, really effective way that just brings a more enriched social care model. And actually, in thanks to Sarah, do you want to say one last thing, Sarah? And then we'll close.
I was going to say, there aren't many win-win opportunities around at the moment, so let's grab this one with both hands. I think it's absolutely great, and to have to know that we're starting from a win-win point. There's some really good practice out there already, and there are absolutely those 4 key levers that we can pull around supply, demand, outcomes, and development of careers that we can do more, and that can only be a positive thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining and spending the time with us. We've recorded this, so it'll be available. If anybody, for any reason, doesn't want people to know that they've been in this webinar, then please do let us know at RVS, and we'll ensure that your names don't appear. But we're really keen for people to be able to watch this back and experience what you've experienced today. So thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. And look forward to seeing you next time on the next Kickstarting the Volunteer Revolution webinar. Thank you all very much.